This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the United States and our foreign policy within the Middle East. The Middle East post-World War I. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled the Middle East from northern Africa out to Iran, collapsed after World War I. And when it did so, the Europeans came in and carved up the Middle East in what's known as the Mandate System. Under this system, Britain got new countries called Iran, Palestine, and Jordan. France got Syria and Lebanon. Britain promised the Jewish people that they would get a homeland under what was known as the Balfour Declaration. The truth was, Britain never lived up to this. The Balfour Declaration promised the Jewish people that they would get a homeland, when in actuality Britain used this as a way to pit Arab against Jewish people. They'd make promises to the Arabs, and they'd make promises to the Jewish people. Eventually this led to a crisis in the conflict in 1948, where the Jewish people eventually just declared a homeland based upon a partition plan that had been drawn up in the United Nations. And that led to a war of independence in 1948, where 5 Arab countries attacked Israel all at once. At the end of that war, Israel not only won, but expanded its land to what we see, almost pretty much of what we see today in Israel. After this war, a man arose in Egypt named Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was an Egyptian military leader. He led a coup against the king of Egypt, and he then had a huge success in nationalizing or taking back what was called the Suez Canal from Britain. After that, he called for a pan-Arab movement. Now, Nasser was not a religious man. Nasser was secular. He based his movement on a notion of a socialist government with Arab unity and an eventual destruction of Israel. When he attempted to do this in 1968, Israel beat him and beat Egypt in the Six-Day War, and that really destroyed his reputation within the Middle East. The reason why that's going to be important is that take a look at who Gamal Abdel Nasser is. Nasser is a secular leader who initially had success, but then had a massive failure in dealing with Israel. If secular leaders are beaten, then who will probably take their place? Well, probably a religious movement. But let's talk a little bit about the Pan-Arab movement so we understand what that was about and why that came into conflict with the religious movement. A Pan-Arab movement saw Arab countries as ideologically one people. They were going to unite under the leadership of Egypt, and their main principles would be nationalism, socialism, and anti-Zionism. Also, Nasser would become a part of a movement called the non-aligned countries. Non-aligned countries were countries that did not join up with either the U.S. or the USSR. They joined up with whatever country would suit their needs best in trying to have independence for their country. When Gamal Abdel Nasser lost, he eventually lost control over Egypt, and he was replaced by another secular leader, a man named Anwar Sadat. Sadat attacked Israel in 1973 during Israel's Yom Kippur holiday. A Yom Kippur holiday is a huge religious holiday, and most of the military in Israel was at home relaxing. This gave Egypt a massive upper hand, and they were able to take a good deal of land. But Israel got its military together and repelled the attacks, and then took 2 major areas, the Golan Heights in the north and the Sinai Peninsula in the south. The Israelis, though, did not see this as a win. They saw it as a partial win. They believed that even though they had gained these lands, they really had not been prepared for this attack. Now, strangely, even though the Arabs lost on this, they saw Sadat as a possible leader for the future because of his initial successes in the war against Israel. But that led to a major positive in the Middle East in many ways, but also a mistake for Sadat in 1980. He met with Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and he agreed in the Camp David Accords, which was negotiated by Jimmy Carter at the time, to have a truce in which Egypt would no longer ever invade into Israel, but Israel would return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. The problem with this for Arab countries was that up until now, Arab countries had already agreed that if you did a negotiation with Israel, it would have to be multilateral, meaning all the Arab countries would have to be a part of it, and that way Israel could not divide up the different countries. Sadat decided to do a bilateral agreement in which he negotiated purely for the interests of Egypt with Israel, and while he had success with this, the other Arab countries saw him as a sellout. And 1 year after he made this agreement, he was seated at a major military rally, and all of a sudden, in the midst of this military rally, a group of people jumped out in front of him and assassinated him with automatic machine guns. The group that did this was a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. So where does the Muslim Brotherhood come from? Well, its origins actually go all the way back to the 14th century with an Islamic writer named Taymiyyah. Taymiyyah had written that the problem with Islam had become that it had become too corrupted by Western powers, and he called for a more pure form of Islam. That was picked up by a man named Abdel in the late 1800s, who followed Taymiyyah's writings and argued that the reason why the Ottoman Empire recently had been growing weaker and weaker was, in his mind, because they were becoming less and less Islamic. He criticized the Ottoman Empire for allowing too much tobacco and alcohol and openness to what he called pagan Greek philosophy, and he began criticizing fellow Muslims under what was called tafiri as being apostates. This was then picked up again in the 1950s by a man named Sayyid Qutb. Qutb read Tahiriyah. He also read the writings of al-Wahhab, and he began making the argument that the problem was that Egypt and Saudi Arabia had turned too much towards oil markets. He then started to observe the defeat of Nasser against Israel. He concluded the problem was apostate Islam. At one point, he traveled to the United States, and he saw us as a liberal culture that allowed for things like sexual promiscuity, alcoholism, and too much modern secular values. On top of that, he was also racist. At one point, he went to different jazz concerts and made the claim that this form of African-American music that was mixing together with white people was causing a degeneracy of culture. So he came back to the Middle East and believed that Islam needed a more pure form of Islamic beliefs. He concluded that Western secular culture had just invaded too much into Arab and Muslim purity. And that led to a rise of this group that was influenced by him called the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1973, Egypt lost against the Yom Kippur War. In 1980, Anwar Sadat made this bilateral agreement with Israel. The Muslim nations responded by forming an organization called OPEC, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a moment. It's called the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. They tried to get back at the West by manipulating oil markets. The Muslim Brotherhood, though, believed that this was not the right way to go, that the better way was through a more pure form of Islam, and they ended up assassinating Anwar Sadat for his compromising or selling out to the West. Now, a little bit about OPEC, because this is really important for understanding the fight that took place. OPEC, like I said, was the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In the 1970s, the Arab countries joined together because of the loss to Israel, and they believed instead of using military to try and fight the West, they would use economics. So what they did was they lowered the production of oil, which created a massive global inflation. And they did this twice, in 1973 and 1979. Now, OPEC's hope was done by the Arab leaders. What we are going to see is that there was a grassroots religious movement that saw all of this as a sellout to economic interests. And that started to rise very strongly in the Afghanistan War in 1980. In 1980, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and a group of Muslim holy warriors called the Mujahideen fought against the communists in Afghanistan because they saw communism as a form of atheism that was invading into the Muslim territories. Now, at the time, we funded the Mujahideen against the Soviets, and it worked. In 8 years, the constant fight against the Mujahideen warriors, who really were not able to fight a conventional war against the Soviets, but they fought a guerrilla warfare in the desert that kept the Soviet Union bogged down and eventually bankrupted them. But the downside to this was it led to several different splinter groups within the Mujahideen. You may have heard of the conspiracy theory that the CIA funded Osama Bin Laden. To a certain extent, this actually is true. It's not true in the way the conspiracy theorists say. Conspiracy theorists believe that we created Osama Bin Laden intentionally. That really is not true. In fact, we didn't even really know about his existence as being any major leader. What we did was we funded the Mujahideen without really understanding that there were different groups within the Mujahideen. One of them was a radical group that was being led by Osama Bin Laden and others like him, who were starting to come up with a new theory about not only how to defeat the Soviets, but eventually how to defeat the U.S. as well. So Osama bin Laden came from an upper-class oil family in Saudi Arabia. He was not out of poverty, came from very wealthy people, but he lost faith in the Saudi Arabian government. He believed that they had become corrupted by oil interests, and so he turned to Sunni Wahhabism and Qutb for a more pure form of Islam. He then criticized Saudi Arabia for allowing the U.S. to invade into the Holy Lands of Islam. In 1991, the U.S. forces, for example, went into Saudi Arabia in order to stop Iraq from invading Kuwait. Now, the Saudi Arabian government saw this as a way to check Saddam Hussein's advancements within the Middle East. But for Osama bin Laden, this was an allowance for the infidel into the Holy Lands. And so Osama Bin Laden came up with a theory about how to defeat the U.S. He created an organization called Al-Qaeda, or the base, which became a new type of terrorist group. In the past, terrorist groups tended to be regional or within certain countries. What Osama Bin Laden did was to create what he believed would be a cross-boundary terrorist group. In his strategy, cells would be sent out throughout the entire world. Cells could include 10 people, 5 people, or even 1 person. And they would be sent out across the world, and when they received signals, they would attack. And one of these attacks was 9/11. The purpose of the 9/11 attack was to attack the economic centers of the United States and draw us into a fight into the Middle East. So the real purpose was not to collapse the World Trade Center in order to destroy the international economy, although they did hope to do that. Their real purpose was A, to attack these economic centers as a symbolic attack, but then B, to get the United States to then go into the Middle East, just like the Soviet Union had done in a long, protracted war that would eventually bankrupt the United States. So President George Bush decided to take what had happened with 9/11 and expand outwards as a strategy. And this is very important to understand. In many ways, it wasn't George Bush's strategy. It was a group of people that influenced him called the neoconservatives. The neoconservatives had long believed since the 1970s that the U.S. could remake the Middle East through our military power and our values. And by doing that, we would be able to protect Israel as well as gain strategic areas of interest within the Middle East. President George Bush agreed with them. They were his major advisors, and came up with something called the Bush Doctrine, or preemptive wars. According to this doctrine, any country that even demonstrated a support for terrorism ought to be taken out in order to make sure that there would be no base for terrorism. Well, when George Bush got us involved inside of Iraq, Al-Qaeda saw an opportunity. They established a splinter group off of their group called AQI, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The leader of this group was a brutal man named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and he realized how to really create a problem within Iraq. Most people at the time believed that Iraq would take 6 months for us to beat. We only beat them in 3 weeks. It didn't take long at all. But we ended up being stuck in Iraq for 5 years. And a big part of the reason why was what Abu Musab al-Zarqawi did. He exploited the divisions between the Sunnis and the Shiites within Iraq. How did he do this? Well, at one point in 2005, he bombed the Al-Askari Mosque in northern Iraq, which set off a civil war between the Sunnis and Shiites because this was such a sacred place for Shiites. This mosque was a sacred place for the Shiites. Al-Qaeda was Sunni. This created even more of a fight. And within Iraq, the Shiites made up the majority of people, the Sunnis the minority. So this kind of an attack led to one attack against the next. Before you knew it, there was this civil war in Iraq that lasted for 3 years. Amidst all of this, Iraq eventually actually calmed down, and by the time we got out to 2007, the Iraqi situation had actually become much more peaceful. But a new conflict was arising within Syria that would draw that AQI group into it. There was a drought in Syria, and it was a massive drought, and it led to a massive emigration of farmers into cities. And when they got to the cities, there was just no support for them. And so these poor conditions led to a protest against the leader of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. Now, Assad is a dictator, and Assad has weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons. He has used them against the people who are fighting against him. And on top of that, Assad is incredibly violent towards his people. And so because of that, it has led to numerous splinter groups fighting against him within Syria and massive destruction of the cities within Syria. AQI saw an opportunity. Al-Qaeda in Iraq moved to Syria and joined against the Shiite Assad. Assad is in many ways really a secular leader, but he comes from a Shiite background. So AQI joined up with the Sunnis who were fighting against Assad. Now, what eventually happened was the Sunnis kicked AQI out of their group because they realized how brutal they were. Not only were they Al-Qaeda, but they actually were worse than Al-Qaeda. In fact, Al-Qaeda itself has kicked this group out of their own organization for their brutality. So this group, known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, became something different. They became what we know today as ISIS, or the Islamic State in Syria. The leader of ISIS is al-Baghdadi, and al-Baghdadi wants to create what he believes is the most pure form of Islam. In Baghdadi's way of looking at the world, you cannot be a true Muslim unless you live under an Islamic caliphate. Remember, Islam is not only a religion, it's also a form of social justice, or a political religion, in which there is a belief that you establish a just government. So under this type of belief, Baghdadi has made the argument that a true Muslim must have a political loyalty to a caliph if they are to be a true Muslim. And one of the first things they did, and it's one of the most important symbolic things things that most people don't get is they went into a middle part of the Syrian desert and they bulldozed down this area of these huge sand embankments. Didn't seem like that big of a deal, but they were cheering for this. Well, why were they doing this? Because that particular area where there were these embankments go back to the European mandate system. This was the boundary between Syria and the other countries. And by removing this boundary, what Baghdadi has done is to make an argument that he has finally removed the European mandate system and is now creating a caliphate throughout the Middle East. So what has been the U.S. reaction? Well, the U.S. reaction has been very confused. And to a certain extent, you can kind of understand why. The different groups that are involved right now within the Middle East make this an incredibly complicated position. In some cases, our allies are also our enemies. President Obama has tried to contain ISIS through a combination of regular bombing of ISIS within their capital, Raqqa, and also working with Arab partners. And to some extent, this has worked. ISIS in the last year has lost 25% of its territory. However, our allies within the area are very complicated. Iran, for example, supports Bashar al-Assad because he is a Shiite, and so they support him against ISIS and other Sunni groups. And so in some ways, we're actually working with Iran, not directly, but indirectly, we're working with Iran to stop ISIS. At the same time, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia are all Sunni groups, and they support Sunni groups against ISIS because even though ISIS is Sunni, they know that ISIS sees Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia as corrupt. But then on top of that, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia being Sunni are against Assad and Iran. So our allies with Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia go against our alliance with Iran. Then you throw into this entire mix Russia, who wants to support Assad for their oil market. Well, we don't really like Assad all that much. So on the one hand, we're glad that Russia is fighting ISIS, but at the same time, we're not so happy that Russia wants to keep Assad in power. So you can see the problem. This is a very complicated mix of European and Middle Eastern countries, and sometimes our allies are our enemies. So what kind of conclusions can we make from this? The middle part of this century, most Middle Eastern governments were secular, and they were basically out for nationalism. Egypt had become the leader of the secular pan-Arab movement, but when Egypt failed, it opened up a vacuum for potential religious purity movements. And now what we're seeing today is a divide in the Middle East. In many ways, the countries fighting in the Middle East are not fighting us. They're fighting each other over who will dominate, Shiite or Sunni. And this is causing massive conflicting alliances that make it very difficult for us to solve the situation in the Middle East.